Welcome back to Data for Dummies. We're your hosts, Nate and
Rabiha. Highly requested, on today's segment of our show, we will be breaking down the 2016 US presidential election. We've received numerous messages from our viewers expressing how outraged they were that Hillary was robbed of the election, and they'd like to know how this happened when things were going so well according to pre-voting polls. We'll be breaking down the poll data and analyzing what the numbers tell us about why there was such a disparity comparing the poll data and the actual outcomes. We'll be looking at things like poll respondents, demographics, population, pollster grades, and the poll data over time.
now let's cut it to our data analysts. Thanks, Nate. I'm your data analyst, Nate, and this is Leela. Before we get into it, let's break down some preliminaries.
First, we'll be going over our data dictionary. We'll be using this set of data focusing on our variables state, polls, duration, pollster grades, population, and raw and adjusted poll data.
We will also be using data from the Census Bureau as well as election result data provided by CNN. Now let's cut it over to our data analyst, Dash.
Thanks, Nate. We must address that while there were 4 presidential candidates, we'll be focusing on Trump and Clinton. This is because this is what most of our viewers are interested in, and from our data dictionary. We can see that their poll data is also negligibly small in comparison to Clinton and Trump. It will not be relevant in the bigger picture. Let's pass it over to our other data analyst, Leela.
Thanks, Dash. Secondly, we like to address the relevancy of raw versus adjusted data. Typically, poll data is adjusted to account for missing demographics and other factors that may have been missing from the data to bring it closer to the actual result. For our analysis, for the most part, we will be using raw poll data as this will tell us more about the inconsistencies between the polls and the actual results. Now, let's dive right in. Nate, can you give us a rundown of the situation?
Thanks, Leela. We all know how shocked we were with the outcome of the election, but let's take a deeper dive at the results versus the poll data that was collected. We started by looking at the election results by state. You will notice straight away that according to the 2016 results on your left, that Trump had won more states and accounted for roughly 52% of the national votes, whereas Clinton only accounted for 48%. However, when we took a look at the poll data on your right, Clinton had accounted for 51% of the national votes and had more votes in Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Florida.
Now, why would this happen? Are polls biased? Were they rigged by the Russians? Let's take a look into who participated in the polls. First, we must define some variables. In this dataset, we see the results are categorized into 4 different groups: LV, RV, A, and V. Typically, pollsters will survey people who represent the general population, or all adults, A, which includes individuals who may not be able to vote. RV, or registered voters, are individuals who are registered to vote. LV, or likely voters, are individuals who are deemed likely to vote either through their affirmations or sampling technique, which takes into account an area or group's previous voting behavior and applies that to the current sample. V, or voters, is a term/population type typically used by the public policy polling group and is characterized by a pollster asking people to hang up if they choose not to vote or won't vote. This doesn't depend on census data, but it does depend on people being self-aware of their likelihood of voting. These 4 types of populations can tell us different things about the data. Let's take a look at what our 2016 election data tells us. Here we have a graph of the national poll data and the different population types. From here we can see a clear picture that Clinton was more popular amongst all population types. We can see here that it seems that Clinton has a much higher popularity in comparison to Trump in the all-adult population type than any other type. We can say that this is due to likely voters, registered voters, and voters skewing to an older or whiter demographic than the general public or all adults group. Older and whiter Americans tend to prefer Republican than any other group. We can see some evidence of this as the distance between the Trump's polls and Clinton's polls is much closer in these population groups in comparison to the all-adult section. In addition to this, we would also like to highlight the type of people who participated in the polls. There were many Trump supporters hesitant to express their opinions due to social pressure and scrutiny of their political views, and thus did not present in the polls. This non-response bias can be a big factor in the inaccuracy of the polls. Let's look further at some state-level data. Here we have a graph of key states that had very close races between Clinton and Trump. We are looking specifically at likely voters, registered voters, and actual results. We notice here that while most groups look proportionate to each other, we see consistently Trump's results bars look much bigger than his likely voters and registered voter bars. This does tie into the shy Trumpers phenomenon, but we must also note that in general, the likely voters and registered voter groups represent a much nicher population than the all voters groups, or the voters. Clinton's likely voters and registered voters groups have an edge over Trump's. Why might this be? Well, another thing to consider is the overrepresentation of college graduates in the poll data. Voters who graduated from a 4-year college degree are more likely to answer surveys than any other adults. And in recent years, they are more likely to support a Democratic for president. Thus, states that have a higher student population have poll data reflecting that. We see this in states like Michigan, where the likely voters and registered voters are fairly high for Democrats. Overall, we can see that there may be a number of demographic-related reasons accounting for poll inaccuracies and misrepresentation of population within the poll data. Another factor to consider is the historic vote of the state. How does this affect poll data versus actual results? We've taken a look at some key races from the election. Let's explore those battle states a bit further. Here we have a heat map of the historic voting behavior of these key states compared to the 2016 election outcome. We can see that a number of states that traditionally voted Democratic vote Republican. Interestingly, we can compare this back to our state-level data graph. We can see that states that have strongly voted Democratic in the past but have voted Republican this election, for example, Michigan or Wisconsin, have a much bigger turnout of likely voters and registered voters, indicating a possible historic voting influence on the poll responses and data. Now that we've had a good look at our poll respondents and voters, let's have a closer look at our pollsters. Leela, please tell us more.
Thanks, Rabiha. Before we begin, let's recap. A pollster is an organization that conducts surveys and in this context is regarding to the 2016 election. For our next analysis, we will take a look at some more state-level data. Did the concentration of polls in each state affect the accuracy of the poll outcomes? Here we have a preliminary graph providing us with a comparison of number of polls administered per state with its population. What can the ratios tell us? We can see that generally, the more pollsters there are relative to a state's population, the more likely the predictions will be accurate. Now that's fairly obvious, right? But it gets interesting when we look deeper. States that were predicted to poll blue were polled by 896 more pollsters than predicted red states. Clinton was predicted to win the election. However, we know from the results that this was not an accurate depiction. 14 out of 29 of the states that were predicted to poll blue ended up polling red during the election. This suggests a discrepancy between people who supported Clinton in the polls or intended to vote blue and people who followed through and showed up at the polls on election day. We will now dive a bit deeper into our pollsters. Just to remind ourselves, a pollster grade is a measure of quality and accuracy given to a pollster by data analyzing organizations that aggregate and break down the data. It is used to assess the reliability and accuracy of polling organizations. Here, we have a graph of the number of pollsters in each grade for randomly selected states. To clarify, pollsters are graded with a plus or minus score as well, but in our graph, we have grouped these into simply A, B, C, and D for simplicity. Let's take a look at our graph and see what it tells us. We see that Florida and Pennsylvania are tied for the most number of pollsters graded A. However, they are also the two states with the most number of pollsters. Florida has by far the most number of Cs, 52, with Ohio having the second most number of Cs, 31. The District of Columbia has the least number of pollsters, at 26, and Michigan is the only state given a D grade. Overall, we see that all states have at least one pollster graded B or C. However, not all states have a grade A pollster. 4 states, Alaska, District of Columbia, Rhode Island, and Wyoming, have 0 A grade pollsters, making it more meaningful for a state to earn a single A than multiple Bs. Our key takeaway from this is that states that had polled red appear to have less A's, and a comparatively smaller proportion of higher grades than states that polled blue. We can see from our table that overall, states that polled red had less polls administered and less accurate pollsters. Blue states had a larger proportion of higher grade pollsters. This reaffirms that polls provided a more distorted picture of the opinions of Americans, which is another factor at play in the discrepancy between the poll results and the actual results on election day. Here, we have a bubble graph showcasing the raw poll numbers for each candidate, graphed against the pollster to population ratio, and grouped by state. Here, the bubble size shows us how many A's pollsters in a given state were awarded. As we can see, there's a high concentration of states with a low pollster ratio and average raw poll numbers. There are a significant number of outlier states who have high pollster ratios but receive low pollster grades. Vermont and North Dakota specific decent number of pollsters for their populations, however received little to no A grades. Now, we'll look at some other factors. Dash, take over for us.
Thanks, Lila. Another big thing to consider is time. Let's take a different angle and look into how our data behaves over time. Firstly, we have a graph of our raw poll data compared to our adjusted over time from November 2015 to November 2016. For this case, we decided to take a look at our raw data and adjusted data because we wanted to confirm trends and see if there are disparities between them over time. We see from our graph that looking at raw poll data, Clinton's popularity in the polls remained relatively high but still have some fluctuations, whereas Trump's popularity varied a lot. In comparison to the adjusted poll data, we see that while Trump's underestimation and Clinton's overestimation is somehow accounted for, it still consistently indicated a substantial lead for Clinton. Simply relying on these polling numbers would leave no doubt about her victory. Nevertheless, as history shows, Trump emerged as the winner. Now let's look at this from a different perspective. We will take a look at some key events that occurred throughout the election that may have shifted the poll data in either direction. We will look closer at the month of August, September, and October of 2016. Around the month of August, there was excessive media coverage regarding Trump and the Muslim military family controversy. At this point, we see a dip in his raw poll data leading up to this event, but also an increase in the aftermath. At the end of September, there was a little effect on polls after the first official debate, an increase in Clinton's poll and a decrease in Trump's. But in between the first and second debate, there was also excessive media coverage, which should have been unfavorable for his poll, but at the same time, there was much more media coverage on Clinton's email controversy, which took over Trump's scandal. This effect is shown as we see an increase in Trump's poll. Clinton's still appears unchanged. Why must this be? Well, from this angle, we can only assume disparities in other areas of the poll. Overall, our key takeaway from this is that in addition to other polling factors, events that occurred during the campaign period affected the way individuals polled and voted on election day.
Well, we looked at a lot of factors that may have contributed to the inaccuracies of the poll data in comparison to the real data.
The data told us the type of participants, or rather non-participants, in the polls greatly affected the impression of how popular each candidate was. Then we saw a number of demographic and historic factors that affected national and state level data. We also saw how the number of polls administered as well as the credibility of the pollsters at the state level may have skewed the polls in Clinton's direction. Finally, we saw how external events had an effect on the polls and how the adjusted versus raw data behaved over time. Overall, we can say that the overestimation of Clinton's poll outcomes is a result of a number of flaws in the polls, encasing an incomplete picture of the opinions of Americans throughout the campaign and election. This just goes to show how important it is to A, think of what exists outside of the data, and B, to participate. Without the participation of Americans, we may have an incomplete picture just like we did in 2016.
Thanks for watching. This has been Data for Dummies.